So thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you. It's been absolutely fascinating over the last couple of days, and I've really enjoyed it. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that this issue of teacher registration and accreditation policies is one part of obviously a very complex puzzle around out-of-field teaching. And it has clear connections with other issues that are being discussed in this summit. Even beyond the out-of-field context, there are implications here for teacher supply. So I think it's a really important issue to be talking about. So just to remind us again of the questions that we're addressing in this session here. And I need to say that I'm going to largely be talking about out-of-field teaching in terms of subject specialisation requirements. And typically that applies to secondary school teaching. Now, we know that there are other more nuanced ways of defining out-of-field teaching. So perhaps in the discussion that follows this session, if your interests around out-of-field teaching lie in other places, you might be able to explore implications in the discussion section. So let's begin by thinking about implications of the various registration and accreditation policies. And to do this, I'd like to think about three kinds of critical points in a process that are kind of connected to each other, and they're not part of the whole landscape. So I think about accreditation, registration, and certification. Now, we know that terminology differs, not just obviously internationally, but even within our own country. So we don't yet have a common language for talking about these things. So I'm going to use these terms so that I can at least be consistent within the space of this presentation. So when I say accreditation, I'm talking about accreditation of initial teacher education programs. Now, we know that in New South Wales, accreditation also extends to accrediting teachers, but I'm going to just talk about it in the context of programs. Registration means registering a teacher. And my screen has gone too forward. So I'm talking about registering teachers here. So this says that the teacher has graduated from an accredited program. And then in some places, including New South Wales in Australia, but also in some other countries, including Ireland, where I've worked for the last 3 years, there is an additional process of certifying teachers. In other words, recording the subjects that teachers are qualified to teach by virtue of their teacher education program. So now we know, of course, that what happens after this process, once teachers apply for jobs in schools, is a whole new territory altogether, and almost anything can happen. So within this space, we have a fairly tightly regulated set of things going on. So this also defines the kind of data that are collected and stored or not. Now, when we think about the requirements for accrediting and then designing initial teacher education programs, certainly if you're an education researcher or a teacher educator, you'd like to assume that these requirements are informed by research into what teachers need to know and to be able to do. And this is where categories of professional knowledge of the type that were proposed by Schulman are very influential. And we do see this information informing accreditation requirements. But that's not all that influences those requirements and frameworks, because there are always cultural and social assumptions at play about what it takes to be a good teacher. And these are the things that can be different from one country to another, sometimes even within the same country. So we know from international comparative research, which is looking at the structure and content of initial teacher education around the world, that there are interesting differences between countries. In some countries, teacher education programs give high emphasis to developing subject matter knowledge and lower emphasis to developing pedagogical content knowledge, the how to teach, while in other countries, the reverse is true. So I want to think about what might be the implications of these differences and these kinds of policies. And of course, there'll be implications for out-of-field teachers and who is defined as being out of field, but there are also other implications for things like teacher supply. So it can be interesting to help us understand our own context if we take a step back and have a look at a different context and see how things work in other countries. So I want to illustrate some differences. I'm going to do some comparisons between countries and then also look at how things have changed over time within one country. And the two countries I'll compare are Australia, which hopefully we all know about, and Ireland, where I gained some experience in the last 3 years. And you might think that Ireland has a lot of similarities with Australia, which clearly it does, but those social and cultural influences really come into play to create some interesting differences. So let's look at program accreditation requirements. Australia first. Now, we know that there is the AITSL program requirements, which then the different jurisdictions can add some things to. But I'm not looking at comparisons within Australia at the moment. I'm just looking at the AITSL requirements here. So I'm looking at secondary programs. So this can be done via an undergraduate pathway or a graduate entry pathway. Let's just look at the undergraduate. It's not so different for graduate entry. So we know that programs have to provide discipline studies to generate subject matter knowledge of at least a major study in one teaching area, equivalent to 3/4 of a year of EFSL. And you think, well, what does that mean, for practical purposes? So the advice is that that translates to 6 semester-long courses. And we still get it a Tower of Babel here because some universities talk about courses, some talk about units. So it's a semester-long chunk of study. And then I think most universities would also offer a second teaching area comprising a minor study equivalent to half a year of EFSL, which would be equivalent to an additional 4 semester-long courses. In addition to the subject matter knowledge, the program has to include discipline-specific curriculum and pedagogical studies, which is a real mouthful. So this is about the how to teach, at least a 1/4 of a year of EFSL for each teaching area. So this is pedagogical content knowledge. And if there are 2 teaching areas, and there's 2 + 2 semester-long courses, no doubt most of us would be very familiar with these requirements. But what does this look like in Ireland? Well, when I arrived in Ireland in 2017, these Irish Teaching Council program accreditation requirements had just come into effect. They were published in 2013, but the rubber hit the road in 2017. And this is for secondary mathematics teachers. I'm a maths educator, so this is the example that I'm giving. So I've underlined the key points of comparison here. So yes, there has to be some discipline studies. So study of mathematics comprising at least 60, this ECTS credits. So the Republic of Ireland is in Europe. There is a common European credit transfer system there. And that equates to 10 semester-long courses in university mathematics. Whereas in Australia, your first teaching area has to be a minimum of 6. Plus, there are some other interesting requirements here. So not only is the volume of study prescribed, but so too are the required topics, and this is the same for all subjects, and the minimum number of credits that have to be achieved in each of those topics. Now, we know that in New South Wales, there are some specific requirements, but this in Ireland, it's really quite constrained. In addition, there are some optional areas of study that can be added in to make up the 60 credits. So that's the knowing the subject. What about the knowing how to teach it? Well, in Ireland, all that's required is 1 module minimum on the teaching of mathematics, carrying a minimum of 5 credits, which is barely 1 semester, a 1 semester long course. It might only be half a semester. So there's a different kind of emphasis here, a different set of expectations that we see in Ireland. Now, I know that there are people teaching mathematics out of field in Ireland who have studied university level mathematics, but not 60 credits. They might have studied an awful lot of mathematics, or maybe they haven't studied these particular areas, and so they are defined as being out of field. Whereas from an Australian perspective, you might not consider such a teacher to be out of field. Now, there are some other interesting implications of these requirements as well, in that it is extremely difficult to change careers into teaching if you've had another professional career first. Because if you don't have these combination of topics and the right number of credits, then you cannot enrol in a postgraduate program. And there are no bridging courses available. So that means, for example, that it's very difficult for someone who's an engineer to change into teaching, because engineers have done an awful lot of mathematics, but they don't necessarily study the topics that are listed here. In fact, if I tried to apply for teacher registration in Ireland, I probably wouldn't get it. I'm a career changer. And in my first Bachelor of Science degree, I had a major in mathematics, but there was no probability in statistics there. So this is an illustration of the way in which these requirements are set up can classify people as being qualified for entry in field or out of field. And it raises the question of, well, how much subject matter knowledge do you need? How much pedagogical content knowledge do you need? Those are not straightforward questions to answer. And these are the kinds of questions, the answers to which set where the goalposts are. However, the goalposts can move over time because accreditation requirements, as we all know, can change, which of course creates a huge amount of work for universities, but there are some other interesting implications as well. So just before I left Ireland in November last year, 2020, new requirements for accrediting initial teacher education programs were published by the Irish Teaching Council. And these will come into force in January 2023 for people seeking registration. So again, looking at mathematics, we still require the specific study of mathematics with 60 credits, that's the same. The same topics are listed, but now the number of minimum credits for each is not there anymore. So you can have, it's a little bit looser. There is still the same optional areas of study as well. And what about the requirement for a certain number of credits for pedagogical content knowledge or methods? Nowhere in the requirements for any subject is this mentioned at all in the new requirements. So I can see Linda shaking her head in amazement. I shook my head in amazement. When universities queried the Teaching Council on this, the response was, oh, well, we just assume that you might do it anyway, which is a very strange way of setting up these requirements. I think this has implications not only for how well graduates might be prepared to teach a subject, but it has also implications for how do you define out-of-field teaching, because now the goalposts have moved. And what about the data that are collected to find out about the incidence of out-of-field teaching? Once things change, do we need to modify our interpretation of, well, when did you get your qualifications? It also has implications for the eligibility of teachers to participate in programs designed to upgrade their skills, if that depends on you being out of field. So these comparisons draw attention not only to the surface features of accreditation, but also make us think about that underlying question of what does it take to prepare a good teacher? So let me move on now to the second question. And I think there are two aspects of this that I'll just touch on briefly. One is about what does it mean to upgrade? But I think the real nub of this question is about culture, and that's where I'll end. So upgrading. And my screen is frozen again. It'll probably jump forward in another minute. Here we are. So some questions. What does it mean to upgrade qualifications? Do we want to upgrade out-of-field teachers' qualifications to the same level as a fully qualified subject specialist, as it's defined in program accreditation requirements? Do we want to place more emphasis on subject matter knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge or some combination of these? So I've tried to think about and list some possibilities that range from the most demanding to the least demanding. And I know we're going to talk about this later on, but I think there's a connection here with accreditation requirements. Now, there are programs that might confer a formal qualification from like a university diploma. I think the most demanding thing that we could possibly ask for, if I can get my screen to go forward again. Okay, look at this one. A full upgrade. It sounds like upgrading computer software, doesn't it? But a full upgrade to meet specialism requirements as laid out in program accreditation guidelines, so that the graduates look just like, you know, a brand new graduate, fully qualified teacher. Well, you might think, well, that's impossible. No one's going to do that. But it does happen in Ireland. And I was in charge of that program. And it happens because there's a specific set of circumstances that make it possible. And those circumstances don't exist in Australia. One of them is that there is certification in Ireland. So you can get mathematics added to your registration. Well, what about a partial upgrade of subject matter knowledge or PCK, such as in a graduate certificate? Again, I created one of these when I was at UQ, 2 subjects in maths and 2 in maths education. Then I would talk about not formal qualifications, but shorter term professional development opportunities, workshops, webinars, resources, or whatever. And now we have interest in micro-credentials that might provide a badge or could count as credit towards a formal qualification. So my question is, do any of these mark a change, if you do these, from being out of field to being in field? Is that what we're looking for? So another thing to think about is that the state of being an out of field teacher is not necessarily permanent. So if you're thinking about who is going to participate in these programs, I could be teaching German out of field this year and not next year. And, you know, I have been asked to teach German. So that's another issue to consider. Finally, then, about fostering a culture of support and endorsement. Just some questions I think we need to think about. I actually have one more slide. What motivates teachers to participate in upgrading programs? There may be extrinsic things that are important, like if there is an increase in salary, which might happen in some countries, whether you get permanent employment or not, or intrinsic things about the boost in confidence, which we certainly found in our Irish program, or shifts in one's identity. Certainly in Ireland, the major benefit was that you get mathematics added to your certification, and that's what influences your career prospects. Now, if that's not there, that might affect incentives for teachers. What are the costs? Who's going to fund this? What are the costs in time? Time for teachers committing here. So in Ireland, the program is extremely demanding, but teachers were given no time off from school to do this. And I don't think that's fair if we're expecting teachers to make this time commitment. Another kind of cost, which is actually a benefit, is in-school support. And I think this is something that the Irish program did not have and should have. And I think this is essential for supporting out-of-field teachers so that they don't feel they're doing everything on their own. What about, we've just heard about the New South Wales process of quality assurance for CPD programs. That doesn't happen everywhere in Australia. That's very resource intensive. I think it's important, though, that if upgrading programs are going to be offered, they need to be quality assured, probably against accreditation standards. And who is going to offer these programs? And then the important question of how is participation going to be recognised, especially if there isn't currently a process for recording one subject qualification. So again, this comes back being connected to accreditation.
Merrilyn, 1 minute.
Right, I'm on my last slide now.
Thank you.
So the final question about culture. And I think the key thing here is, and we've talked about this yesterday and today, the first requirement is to acknowledge that a problem exists. And then I'm going to turn that question around and ask, what are the consequences of not developing and endorsing upgrading programs? And I will leave that thought with you, and I look forward to the conversations that we will have in the next session. So thank you.